She came to Kansas with a single trunk, a borrowed hope, and a name she'd only seen written on paper. The man waiting at the station didn't smile. The little girl beside him didn't look up. The town watched from doorways like she was already something to feel sorry for. Evelyn Hartwell had answered a practical arrangement, not a love letter, not a promise. Just a rancher who needed help, and a woman who had run out of other options. What nobody told her was that the ranch was one bad season from gone. The trader who bought their wool had been stealing from them for years, and the man she'd married on paper hadn't let himself need anyone in a very long time. They all expected her to last maybe a month. She intended to prove every single one of them wrong. If you've ever had to build something from nothing, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The train didn't slow gracefully into Granger. It groaned and lurched and wheezed out the last of its steam like an animal that had been pushed past what it could reasonably give, and Evelyn Hartwell stood in the aisle, gripping the overhead rack with both hands, and told herself that the shaking was the train, not her nerves, though she was honest enough to know it was probably both. She had her trunk in the cargo car. She had $14.60 in the inner pocket of her coat. She had the letter folded 4 times and tucked against the lining where she'd put it 3 weeks ago when she first read it, though by now she had every line memorized, whether she meant to or not. Practical arrangement. Widow with a daughter. Sheep ranch outside Granger. Looking for a woman of steady character and willing disposition. She'd read those words so many times they had stopped meaning anything, which was perhaps for the best. The platform appeared through the window, a narrow strip of weathered board. 2 men stacking feed sacks at the far end, a hand-painted sign that read Granger in letters that had been sun-bleached to the color of old bone. Kansas in February. She had known it would be cold. She had not quite imagined this particular shade of cold, the kind that came through the glass before the train even stopped, the kind that said, "This is not a place that cares about your comfort." She picked up her bag, the small one she'd kept at her seat, and moved toward the door before most of the other passengers were on their feet. The conductor gave her a look, not unkind, just measuring, and she didn't drop her eyes, which seemed to satisfy him enough that he moved on without comment. The cold hit her on the steps, full in the face, no apology. The wind off the open country west of town carried grit in it, fine particles of frozen dirt that stung the skin around her eyes. She descended to the platform and stood still for a moment, getting her bearings, scanning the sparse scattering of people who had come to meet the train. She found him almost immediately, which surprised her. She had expected more difficulty, had imagined herself standing there searching, growing uncertain, but he was not a difficult man to spot. He stood apart from the others near the far end of the platform, a tall man with the build of someone who had been doing heavy work since before he was fully grown, wearing a canvas coat that had seen better years and a hat pulled low against the wind. He was not looking at her. He was looking somewhere past the train, at the flat white distance beyond the station, as if he were already somewhere else in his mind and had to make himself come back to the present moment. The little girl was beside him, holding his hand. She was perhaps 7, with dark braided hair and her father's same serious expression, wearing a coat that was clean but too thin for the weather. She, unlike her father, was looking directly at Evelyn, not with hostility, with the careful, neutral assessment of a child who had learned early that it paid to form your own opinions. Evelyn walked towards them. The boards under her feet were uneven, and one of her boot heels caught a gap and she stumbled slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to feel ungraceful, and she straightened herself and kept walking. The man had turned to watch her approach. His face was a difficult thing to read. Sharp-featured, weathered, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested either poor sleep or deep worry, possibly both. He was younger than she'd expected. His letter had read older somehow. Maybe that was what grief did to a person's written voice. "Miss Hartwell," he said. It wasn't a question. His voice was lower than she'd anticipated, rough at the edges. "It's Evelyn," she said. She stopped a few feet away from him and did not offer her hand because it seemed too formal for the particular strangeness of the situation, and she wasn't sure he'd take it anyway. "Mr. Calloway." "Rhett," he said. He glanced down at her small bag, then back toward the cargo car. "You have a trunk?" "One." He nodded, said nothing else, and walked toward the cargo car without any additional ceremony. Evelyn looked at the little girl. "You must be Maisie," she said. The girl looked up at her steadily. "You're taller than I thought you'd be," she said. "Is that good or bad?" Maisie considered this with the gravity of someone weighing an important matter. "I don't know yet," she said. "That's fair," Evelyn said. "I'll let you figure it out." The wagon ride to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and most of it passed in silence. Rhett drove. Maisie sat between them, pressed slightly more toward her father. Evelyn watched the country open up around them as Granger fell behind, the land flattening and widening into something that felt less like a place and more like a condition. Endless pale grass bent sideways by the wind, the occasional dark line of a fence post string running toward a horizon that kept retreating. The sky was enormous. She had grown up in Missouri, and Missouri had trees enough to break the sky into manageable pieces. This was different. This sky said you are small, and said it without malice, which almost made it worse. "The flock is about 200 head, Rhett said, not looking at her. It seemed to cost him something to start talking. "Mostly Rambouillet crosses, good wool producers when the weather cooperates." "How many bred ewes?" He turned his head slightly. The question had apparently surprised him. 63. Lambing starts in about 3 weeks if the timing holds. First-timers among them? 18 or so. Evelyn nodded and looked back out at the road. She could feel him reassessing something about her, though she couldn't tell what conclusion he was reaching. "You know sheep," he said. "My grandfather ran merinos in Ohio before he lost the land. I spent summers with him from age 8 until he died. I'm not an expert, but I'm not starting from nothing." A silence. Then, "The letter didn't say that." "The letter asked for steady character and willing disposition. I had both of those too." Something shifted slightly around his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one, quickly set aside. Maisie, who had been staring at the road ahead, glanced up at Evelyn with the faintest recalibration visible in her expression. They didn't speak again until the ranch came into view. It was not a beautiful property. She had not expected it to be, but there was a particular kind of plainness to it that went beyond mere practicality. The plainness of a place where someone had stopped paying attention to anything beyond the immediate demands of survival. The main house was a square, sturdy structure with a good roof but peeling paint and a porch that sagged on the left side. Behind it, the barn was larger than she had expected and in better condition, which told her something about where Rhett Calloway's priorities lived. 2 outbuildings that she'd learn later were a storage shed and a small equipment shelter. A well with a rope pulley that had been repaired with wire at some point. A kitchen garden gone to stalks and frozen mud. The sheep were in the far pasture. Even at this distance, she could see them, pale shapes moving slowly against the dull brown grass, heavy with their wool and their coming lambs, indifferent to the wind in the particular way of creatures that have no alternative to endurance. "It needs work," Rhett said. He'd pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and was looking at it himself, as if he hadn't quite looked at it directly in some time. "Most worthwhile things do," Evelyn said. He got down and went to collect her trunk from the wagon bed. She stepped down herself before he came around to help her. She saw him note this too, the way he'd been noting things since the platform, adding each detail to some internal accounting she couldn't see the result of. Maisie had already slipped off the wagon and gone to the porch, where she stood holding the door handle but not opening it, looking back at Evelyn. "I'll show you the inside," the girl said. Her voice had changed slightly. Still careful, but there was something underneath it now, a kind of cautious ownership, a child who was not quite sure whether to guard her territory or offer a tour of it. "I'd appreciate that," Evelyn said. The inside of the house was cleaner than the outside had suggested, which she revised slightly when she looked more carefully and realized that clean was relative, and what it actually was functional. Dishes washed, floor swept, nothing left to rot, but the particular warmth of a household that has a woman's attention entirely absent. No curtains. 1 rug worn to threads in the traffic lanes. A kitchen table with 3 mismatched chairs. A wood stove that was doing its best, and a parlor that had a good stone fireplace someone had not lit in what looked like weeks, a thin skin of dust on everything that wasn't in daily use. Maisie walked her through each room with the thoroughness of a guide who had prepared for this. The girl's bedroom was small and surprisingly personal. A row of smooth stones on the windowsill, a sketch of a horse pinned to the wall, a worn quilt in a complex pattern that Evelyn guessed had come from a grandmother or an earlier time. She didn't comment on any of it. Some things you notice and hold quietly because noticing aloud can feel like an intrusion. Her own room was off the back hallway. Small, with one window that looked toward the barn, a narrow bed with a wool blanket, and a chest of drawers with a cracked mirror above it. There was a hook on the back of the door and nothing else. "Papa said you could change anything you needed to," Maisie said. She was standing in the doorway, arms slightly stiff at her sides. "I probably won't change much at first," Evelyn said. She set her bag on the bed and turned back toward the girl. "I'd rather learn what's here before I start rearranging things." Maisie studied her for a moment. "Mrs. Beaumont, who used to help us, she rearranged everything the second day. Papa didn't like it." "Who's Mrs. Beaumont?" "She was the woman before you. She left after 6 weeks." Maisie paused. "So did Miss Alcott. She lasted 3. Evelyn absorbed this. "How many have there been?" 3, Maisie said. "You're the 4th. She delivered this without cruelty, in the same neutral tone she'd used since the platform. Purely informational. "Well," Evelyn said, "I don't have anywhere better to be, so I expect I'll stay longer than 6 weeks." Maisie's expression didn't change, but she didn't leave the doorway either. She stayed there a moment longer, her hand on the doorframe, as if she were thinking about saying something else. She didn't. She just nodded once and went back down the hall. Dinner was venison stew that Rhett had left in the pot that morning, and bread that Maisie had made herself with a concentration that spoke to regular practice. Evelyn had found the kitchen during the late afternoon and spent an hour quietly learning its geography. Where things were kept, what was running low, what the stove's temperament was like. She did not try to make dinner. It was too early to take over things that belonged to other people. Instead, she had the stove going well and the kitchen warm by the time Rhett came in from the barn. And she thought she saw him notice this, though he didn't say anything. They ate. The wind had picked up outside. It pushed at the windows and found the gaps around the doorframe and came in as cold drafts that moved the lamp flame. Maisie ate with her elbows off the table and her back straight, habit someone had drilled into her early, and she cut her bread into exactly 4 pieces before eating it, which Evelyn found oddly endearing. "I'd like to see the flock tomorrow morning," Evelyn said, halfway through the meal, "if that's agreeable." "I go out at first light," Rhett said. "I can be up at first light." He looked at her across the table. In the lamplight, his face was easier to read than it had been in the open air. She could see the tiredness more clearly, and underneath it something that looked less like suspicion and more like someone who had been disappointed enough times that they had stopped anticipating otherwise. "It's cold before dawn," he said. "I grew up in Missouri winters," she said. "I won't need looking after." Another small silence, then, "All right." Maisie had been watching this exchange carefully. She looked at Evelyn. She looked at her father. She picked up her 4th piece of bread. "The one with the torn ear is named Biscuit," she said. "She's my favorite. She had twins last year." "I'll look for her," Evelyn said. Maisie nodded and bit her bread and said nothing more. Later, after Maisie was in bed and the kitchen had been cleared, Evelyn found herself alone in the parlor with a lamp in the cold. She had pulled the window curtain. There was only one, hanging at an angle from a single remaining ring, and could hear the wind working at the eaves. Somewhere in the dark outside an animal moved, too large to be anything small and too quiet to be the cattle she'd spotted in the east pasture. She had her journal with her, a habit since she was 12, and she opened it to a fresh page. She wrote the date and the location, and then sat for a moment looking at the blank space beneath it. "The ranch is in worse shape than the letter implied," she wrote, not dishonestly so. "I think he was describing what it is when things go well, not what it currently is. There's a difference between a struggling place and a hopeless one. This is the first kind. Maybe." She paused, wrote, "The girl is smart. She's testing me the way sensible children test things, carefully, without committing." She paused again. "He doesn't talk much. I don't know yet if that's grief or character, or just habit, probably all 3. She closed the journal and sat a while longer, listening to the wind, and looked at the cold fireplace and thought about what it would take. Not the specific mechanics of it, not yet. That would come with time and a clearer picture of the numbers and the land, but the general requirement, to take something worn down and convince it to run again. She had seen her grandfather do it with land that everyone else had given up on, had watched him coax life out of soil people thought was played out, and she had never forgotten the central lesson of that. You have to look at what's actually there, not what you've been told to expect. What was actually here was a barn in good repair and a healthy flock, and 63 bred ewes coming up on lambing season, and a man who had kept all of it running alone through what looked like a very hard year. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the beginning of something. She banked the stove for the night and took the lamp to bed. What? The morning came earlier than her body was prepared for, and colder than the evening had been, which seemed unfair. She dressed in the dark, her breath visible in the air of her room, and she was outside and moving toward the barn by the time a gray light was just beginning to separate the land from the sky. Rhett was already there. She could see the barn light through the gaps in the planking before she reached the door. She pulled it open and the warm smell of sheep and hay and lanolin hit her, a smell she had not encountered since childhood, and which her body recognized before her mind did, some deep animal familiarity that was almost comforting. He was moving along the row of pens, checking each ewe in the methodical way of someone running a checklist he had long since internalized. He had a bucket of grain, and he offered each animal a handful as he assessed her, running his free hand over haunches and sides with the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was feeling for. He looked up when she came in. He didn't seem surprised. "Sleep all right?" he asked. "Well enough," she said. It was mostly true. She went to the nearest pen and leaned on the rail to look. The ewe inside turned toward her with the particular and curious appraisal of sheep. Chewing slowly, one ear ticked forward. Her belly was broad and heavy. She moved with the careful deliberateness of late pregnancy. "She's close," Evelyn said. "Couple weeks, maybe less." He moved on to the next pen. "You said you knew your grandfather's flock." "Spent 3 summers with it, from 8 to 11. He died when I was 12. Merinos, you said." "Yes, we ran about 160 at peak. He lost the land to debt, not to the sheep. They were good animals." Rhett had stopped at a pen near the back. A ewe who was somewhat smaller than the others, pen kept separate, with a piece of rope tied around the top rail to mark it. He was looking at her with an expression that had concern in it. "This one's been off her feed since yesterday," he said. "She's not one of the bred ewes, yearling." Evelyn came to stand beside him and look. The yearling was resting in the corner of the pen, her sides rising and falling more quickly than they should have been. Her eyes were slightly dull. Her ears were low. Evelyn opened the pen and went in without asking. She knelt beside the ewe and ran her hands along the animal's sides, pressed gently at her abdomen, checked her gums. The ewe submitted to this with a passivity that was itself a sign. A healthy yearling would have had more objection. "How long has she been breathing fast?" "I noticed it yesterday evening. She was fine at midday check." "Any others near her?" "She was in the south pen until this morning. I moved her when I saw she wasn't eating." Evelyn sat back on her heels, looking at the animal. "Could be pneumonia starting. Could be a worm load. Her gums are pale." She looked up at him. "Do you have a thermometer for the animals?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he went to the shelf along the back wall and came back with a glass thermometer and handed it to her. She took the temperature. It was high. Not catastrophically, not yet, but it was high enough to confirm that something was wrong and that if it progressed, it would become harder to address. "I'd like to try an Epsom drench and see if she'll take some warm water with molasses in it," Evelyn said, "and she should be watched tonight." "I don't usually watch individuals overnight," he said. Not defensively, just as fact. "I know, but she's early stage, and if it's respiratory, the first 24 hours matter." She looked at him. "I'll watch her." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the ewe, then at Evelyn. "You've done this before." "Once or twice. My grandfather lost a third of his flock one winter to a respiratory outbreak he caught too late. He was specific about what he wished he'd done differently." Rhett was quiet for a long moment. He had a way of going silent that was not dismissive. It was more like someone working through something carefully, respecting the weight of a decision. Finally, he said, All right, we'll do it your way. Well, she mixed the drench in the small tin pail she found on the shelf. Warm water, molasses, a measure of Epsom salts, a small amount of apple cider vinegar from the kitchen stores. The ewe took it grudgingly, most of it, which was better than nothing. Evelyn stayed with her through the morning, coming back to the house only long enough to eat a piece of bread and check on Maisie, who had come down and was doing her lessons at the kitchen table with the focused silence of a child who did her work without being asked. "Is the yearling sick?" Maisie asked without looking up from her slate. "Yes, we're watching her." "What's her name?" "I don't know. Does she have one?" Maisie thought about this. "Clover," she said. "She used to come to the fence when I picked clover in the south pasture in summer." "I'll call her Clover," Evelyn said. She went back to the barn. By late afternoon, Clover had taken a little dry hay and her breathing had eased fractionally, which was not a guarantee of anything, but was at least not worsening. Rhett had come in 3 times during the day, checking the other animals, checking on Evelyn without quite seeming to, bringing her a tin mug of coffee around noon that she was grateful for in a way that was difficult to express without seeming pathetic. The afternoon light through the high barn windows was the flat pale gold of late winter, and it fell across the straw at a low angle that made the whole space look briefly warmer than it was. Evelyn sat on an overturned bucket beside Clover's pen and worked at her journal, noting what she'd seen, what she'd done, what the signs were. She had started making records like this during her first summer with her grandfather. He'd believed in keeping notes on each animal, tracking what worked and what didn't, building up a body of knowledge that outlasted any single season. She was writing when she became aware of Rhett standing at the end of the barn, not quite approaching. She looked up. "She looks better," he said. "A little. Not out of it yet." He came down the aisle and stood outside the pen, looking at the ewe. "You sat with her most of the day." "I did." "You didn't have to." "I know." She closed her journal and looked at him. "My grandfather always said that a shepherd who gives up early on a sick animal has already made a decision about what the animal is worth. He didn't believe in giving up early." Rhett was quiet again. He had his hands in his coat pockets, and he was looking at the ewe, not at Evelyn, and she couldn't tell what he was thinking. "The previous women," he said slowly. "They weren't bad people. It wasn't a good match. The work is hard, and this isn't a comfortable place." "I know it's not. And I'm not—" He stopped, tried again. "I don't talk much. I know that makes it harder." "You've talked more today than I expected," she said. It came out more directly than she'd intended, and she saw him blink slightly. "I mean that as a good thing. I'm not looking for conversation every hour, but some is better than none." He looked at her then, really looked, the way he hadn't quite been doing since the platform, and she held the look because looking away would have been wrong. "You know things," he said finally. It didn't sound like a compliment exactly, more like a piece of new information he was still working into his assessment. "Some things," she said. "Not everything. I'll probably make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes out here. Then I'll fit in fine." That almost smile crossed his face again. She noticed that it reached his eyes, faintly, before it retreated. She filed that away too. She sat up with Clover until past midnight. The barn was cold, and she had brought a second blanket and her journal and the small stub of a candle, and she sat on the overturned bucket and listened to the sound of the sheep and the wind outside and the occasional creak of the roof in the cold. At some point she fell asleep sitting up, her back against the post, her chin dropping toward her chest. She woke to a sound she couldn't immediately identify, a soft, close sound, and found that Clover had come to the front of the pen and was pressing her nose against the low rail, her eyes on Evelyn, her ears forward in the alert position that meant she was present, was paying attention, was alive in a way she hadn't quite been 12 hours ago. "There you are," Evelyn said quietly. The ewe breathed slow and even. Her sides were no longer working so hard. She blinked once, slowly. Evelyn reached through the rail and ran her hand along the animal's jaw. Clover didn't pull back. She stood there and accepted it, which was, in its way, a kind of trust that had to be earned rather than assumed. Outside, the wind had quieted somewhat. The barn was still cold, but the cold had lost its aggressive edge, or maybe she had just gotten used to it. Through the gaps in the siding, she could see that the sky was beginning to gray at the very edge of the east, the first faint suggestion of another day coming. She was still sitting there, her hand against Clover's face, when she heard the barn door open and Rhett's boots on the floor. He stopped when he saw her, when he saw the ewe at the rail, ears up, looking toward the light. "She's better," Evelyn said. He stood there a moment, and his face did something complicated that she thought might have involved relief, and maybe something else, though she wasn't certain, and she didn't stare. "You stayed all night," he said. "I told you I would." He came down the aisle and stood outside the pen and looked at the ewe, and his hand went to the rail in the same automatic way hers had. Clover pressed her nose against his palm. "She trusts you," Evelyn said. "She was born here." He was quiet a moment. "Thank you," he said. He said it like a man who didn't say it often, not withheld, but rusty, a little awkward in his mouth. "For watching her. She wasn't done yet," Evelyn said. "That's all? She just needed someone to stay with her long enough to find that out." He looked at her then, and for just a moment the careful distance he'd been maintaining since the platform was not there. She could see how tired he was, and how long he'd been tired, and underneath that something that might have been, in a different life, before whatever had happened to hollow out the edges of him, something that might have been warmth. Then he looked back at Clover and the moment closed. "I'll start the morning rounds," he said. "I'll get breakfast started," she said. She stood up, stiff from the long night, her back protesting, and walked toward the barn door, and the cold outside air hit her like a wall. And the sky above the flat country was the particular gray-pink of early winter morning, and the sheep were beginning to move in the far pasture, and the ranch looked, for just a moment, in that cold and particular light, like something that had not yet made up its mind whether to fail or to endure. She thought it might endure. She was not sure yet, but she was going to stay long enough to find out. Clover recovered fully by the end of that first week, which Evelyn noted in her journal with the same plain language she used for everything else: date, symptoms, treatment, outcome, but which meant more than the words suggested. It was the first thing on the Callaway Ranch that had gone the way she'd hoped, and she was careful not to make too much of it, not outwardly, because she knew that one recovered yearling did not a saved ranch make, and because Rhett Callaway was not a man who responded well to celebration that hadn't been earned yet. But Maisie had come to the barn on the third morning, when Clover was standing at the rail with her ears up and her eyes clear and her appetite back, and the girl had pressed her face against the animal's wool and stood there for a long moment without saying anything. And Evelyn had found something to do at the far end of the barn so that she didn't intrude on it. That was the beginning of the change between them, though it didn't announce itself that way. It came gradually, the way trust always does when it's the real kind, not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of small ones. Maisie started appearing in the kitchen in the mornings before Evelyn had to call her. She started asking questions, not the testing kind she'd asked on the platform, but genuine ones, practical ones, the questions of a child who has decided that another person's knowledge is worth having. She asked about the difference between a Rambouillet and a Merino. She asked why Evelyn salted the stew the way she did, adding it in stages. She asked one evening, sitting at the table with her slate while Evelyn mended a pair of work gloves, whether Evelyn had ever been to a city. "St. Louis," Evelyn said. "Once. I was 17. What was it like?" "Loud. More people than I knew what to do with. The streets smelled bad." She paused. "There were beautiful things, too. A park with an iron fence and elm trees. A bakery that made something with cardamom that I've never been able to recreate." Maisie considered this. "I've never been anywhere except Granger and one time Wichita." "What did you think of Wichita?" "It was big." A pause. "I didn't like the way people looked at us." Evelyn looked up from the mending. "What do you mean?" Maisie's expression was matter-of-fact, the way children are sometimes matter-of-fact about things that should have been too heavy for them to carry so casually. "After Mama died, people looked at us different, like we were something that had gone wrong." She turned her slate over on the table. "I don't think they meant to, but they did." Evelyn set the glove down. "People don't always know what to do with grief that isn't theirs. So they look at it too long or they don't look at all. Neither one feels good." Maisie was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mama died in the spring, 2 years ago. It was a fever." I know, Evelyn said. Your father mentioned it. He doesn't talk about her much. Some people carry things quietly, Evelyn said. It doesn't mean they feel it less. Maisie looked at her with the particular directness that was becoming familiar. Did you lose someone? Evelyn thought about her answer. She was not going to lie to this child, and she was not going to burden her either. My mother, she said, when I was 10, so I know something about how the world looks different after. Maisie turned her slate right side up again and picked up her chalk. She didn't say anything else, but the quality of the silence between them had shifted, had become the comfortable kind, the kind between people who have said something real and don't need to fill in the space afterward. The housework itself was not what Evelyn had expected, which was to say it was harder and also in some ways simpler. Hard because the house had been managed for 2 years by a man who was doing his absolute best and who had no margin left in his days for anything beyond essential maintenance. Simple because the problems were visible and solvable. A draft in the back hallway that turned out to be a gap in the window frame she filled with rope caulk. A stovepipe connection that had worked itself loose and was losing heat. A pantry that had been organized with no logic she could identify, and which she spent one afternoon rearranging so that the things used daily were in reach without climbing a stool. She did not move the furniture. She did not take down the single photograph from the parlor wall, a formal portrait of a woman with dark eyes and Maisie's serious mouth, wearing a dress too nice for daily life, sitting very straight. She had no intention of disturbing that. Some presences in a house are structural. What she did do was find a set of old curtain rings in the bottom of the dry goods box and use them to hang a cloth over the parlor window that cut the draft considerably. She started a fire in the parlor fireplace on the 4th evening, having confirmed with Rhett that it was drawing properly, and by the time he came in from the evening round the room was warm in a way it clearly had not been in a long time. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment, and she saw something cross his face that she thought was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. Haven't used that room much, he said. I noticed. She was sitting near the fire with her mending, and she didn't look up. There's no law says it can't be used. He didn't come in that evening. But the next evening, he did. And he sat in the other chair with a piece of harness he was repairing, and they sat in the same warm room without conversation for the better part of an hour, which was not nothing. It was during the 3rd week that she found the ledger. She had not been snooping. She had been looking for the household accounts because she wanted to understand the basic arithmetic of the place. What was coming in, what was going out, where the pressure points were. She had asked Rhett for the figures, and he had told her, roughly, what she already knew from looking at the state of things. It was tight. Very tight. The wool revenue came once a year and they stretched it as far as it would go, and it was never quite far enough. The ledger was in the back of the desk drawer in the parlor, behind a folded bill of sale and a leather folder of old correspondence. It was a plain green-covered account book, its spine cracked, the pages warped from what she assumed was a spill at some point. She opened it at the kitchen table while Maisie was in the barn, and Rhett was out in the far pasture. She turned the pages slowly. The records went back 4 years, before the wife died, and after. She could see the difference. The earlier pages were in 2 different hands, one of them neat and smaller, and the entries were more detailed, more organized. After the 2nd year, the entries were in one hand only, larger and less regular. The handwriting of a tired man doing one more task at the end of a long day. She was looking at the wool revenue column. She had a general sense of what Rambouillet fleece was worth. Her grandfather had sold merino, which commanded a higher price, but the principle was the same, and she'd listened to him talk about the market enough to carry rough numbers in her head. She knew that premium fleece, clean, well-skirted, with good staple length, commanded a different price than ordinary grade. The numbers in this ledger were wrong. Not wrong in the sense of addition errors, wrong in the sense of being too low. Consistently, year after year, too low. The fleece weight sold and the revenue received did not match what she knew the market should bear, not even allowing for transportation costs and trade fees and the inevitable variation of a bad year. She turned back to the earliest entry and worked forward slowly, adding in her head. By the time Rhett came in for dinner, she had gone through it twice. She waited until Maisie had eaten and gone to bed. She waited until the dishes were done and the kitchen was quiet. She set the ledger on the table between them. I found the accounts, she said. He looked at the book. He didn't look defensive, just cautious. I keep them in the desk. I know, I was looking for the household figures. She sat down across from him. Who sells your wool? Emmett Straw. He's been trading with ranchers in this county for 20 years. Does he buy from most of the sheep operations around here? Most of them, yes. He comes through twice a year, spring and fall. He was watching her now. Why? She opened the ledger to the wool revenue column and turned it toward him. Your wool is worth more than this, she said, significantly more. Your fleece records show consistent weights and clean clips. Rambouillet Cross of that quality should bring between 20 and 25 cents per pound on the current market. You've been receiving between 12 and 14. Rhett looked at the numbers. He didn't speak immediately. Market varies, he said. It varies some, Evelyn said. Not by that much. Not every year in the same direction. She kept her voice even. She was not going to say this with anger because anger wasn't useful here, and because what she was saying was a hard enough thing to hear without the additional weight of someone's emotion on top of it. I'm not saying I have this entirely figured out, but I think you should get a second opinion on what your fleece is worth before straw comes through again. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. He was looking at the ledger, not at her, and his jaw had gone slightly tight. Emmett Straw has been doing business with this family since before I married, he said. I know that. He's the same man who extended credit to my father-in-law after a bad year. He stopped. He's not someone who would. Evelyn didn't say anything. She let the silence sit between them because she knew the next move was not hers. She had put the information in front of him, and she couldn't decide what he did with it. He looked up at her finally. His expression was complicated. Not angry at her, she didn't think, but not comfortable either. Where are you getting your prices from? My grandfather's records, and what I've been reading in the agricultural papers at the Granger post office while I wait for the mail. She paused. I could be wrong. I might be reading the market wrong, or misunderstanding something about how straw's fees work, but I don't think I am. You've been looking into this, he said. It wasn't an accusation exactly, but there was something careful in his voice. I've been trying to understand how the ranch works, she said. That's all. Another silence. The lamp between them flickered in a draft. Outside the wind was picking up again, the familiar sound of a Kansas night making its presence known. I need to think about it, he said. That's fair. He closed the ledger. He didn't hand it back to her, which she took to mean that he was going to look at it himself, which was what she wanted. She got up and went to the stove to bank it for the night, and she heard his chair push back and his boots on the floor, and by the time she turned around, he was gone down the hall. No. He thought about it for 2 days, which was visible in the way he moved through those days, quieter than usual, which was saying something, and with a particular preoccupied set to his shoulders that she recognized as a man working through something he didn't want to be working through. Maisie noticed it too. On the second morning, she appeared at Evelyn's elbow while Evelyn was making biscuits and said quietly, Papa's thinking about something bad. He's thinking about something difficult, Evelyn said. That's not quite the same thing. Maisie turned this over. What's the difference? Bad is when you're trying to get away from something. Difficult is when you're trying to walk toward it. She turned the dough once. Your father's not a man who runs away from things. Maisie picked up a piece of dough trim that had fallen on the board and ate it without asking, which was the first genuinely childlike thing Evelyn had seen her do. How do you know that? Because he's still here, Evelyn said. After 2 bad years and a hard winter, he's still here. Maisie was quiet, chewing, then, You're still here too. I suppose I am. On the evening of the second day, Rhett came in from the barn while Evelyn was at the kitchen table with the ledger and her own notebook, working through the numbers again. He stood at the end of the table and she looked up. I wrote to a man I know in Abilene, he said. He runs a wool operation larger than mine. I asked him what he's been getting per pound. Evelyn waited. He wrote back. He put a folded letter on the table. 22 cents last fall. He sold to a cooperative buyer, not straw. She looked at the letter. She looked at him. You've been getting 13, she said. 13 and a half, he said. His voice was flat. Not flat like he didn't feel anything. Flat like a man who is keeping the feeling in a box for the moment because he has to. For 4 years. The kitchen was very quiet. The stove ticked. Outside, a sheep called once, distant, and went silent. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. She meant it simply. She was not triumphant, and she was not going to perform outrage on his behalf. This was his loss to feel, not hers to dramatize. He pulled the chair out across from her and sat down heavily. He put both hands on the table, not quite flat, and looked at them. "My father-in-law trusted him," he said. "Clara trusted him. I just kept using him because that's how it had always been done." A pause. "That's not a good reason." "It's a human reason," Evelyn said. "Trust what you know. Don't look too hard at things that seem stable. Most people do the same thing. It cost us." He looked up at her. "I don't know exactly how much. I've been working on an estimate." She turned her notebook toward him. The numbers were laid out in her clear, neat hand. Not an accusation, just an accounting. The gap between what they had received and what the market would have paid multiplied across 4 years, with the conservative assumptions built in. He read it. She watched his face, and she didn't look away because she thought it would be disrespectful to. The number was not small. It was the kind of number that explained a great deal about the state of the house, and the wagon, and the coat Maisie wore that was too thin. "When is Straw due back?" Evelyn asked. 6 weeks, maybe 7. He comes when the lambs are on the ground and the spring clip is ready." "Then we have 6 weeks," she said, "to have the accounts clear, the records in order, and an alternative buyer identified so that you have something to walk away to if he won't deal fair." Rhett looked at her. "You think he won't?" "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "that a man who has been setting his own prices for 4 years without challenge may not immediately agree to change when challenged, but I could be wrong about him." He was quiet. He looked at her notebook again, at the number she'd laid out. There was a muscle working in his jaw that she had started to recognize as Rhett Calloway, dealing with something he wanted to put his fist through, but was choosing instead to deal with through some other channel. "I'm not good at this kind of thing," he said. "Confrontation, negotiating." He said it plainly, not with embarrassment, just as a fact about himself. Clara was better at it. She would have dealt with this faster than I did. Evelyn didn't respond to that immediately. She thought about it for a moment, about the right thing to say, and then she said, "You're dealing with it now. That's what matters." He looked at her, and she held the look. "I'll help you put together what we need," she said. "Records, weights, grades, market comparisons. You'll have something solid to stand on." She paused. "But I want you to understand, I'm not trying to run your operation for you. I'm trying to give you what you need to run it better than you've been able to because you've been working with bad information." He was quiet long enough that she wasn't certain how he was going to take this. Then he said, "You think there's a difference? A significant one?" Another pause. Then, not quite a smile, but with something in it. "All right, where do we start?" She turned to a fresh page in her notebook. "You start by telling me everything you know about how Straw grades the fleece. What he says, what he writes down, how he arrives at his numbers. I'll tell you what I know about what those grades should be worth." He leaned forward and started talking, and this time the words came easier than they had before, as if something that had been held under pressure had been given a small opening, and the evening went long and the lamp burned low, and outside the wind moved across the flat Kansas country in its cold, indifferent way. But inside the kitchen there were 2 people bent over a table of numbers, building something that Emmett Straw was not going to find easy to ignore. The days after that had a different quality to them. Not easier. Lambing season was drawing closer and the ranch work didn't lighten, and there were 3 straight days of sleet in the last week of February that kept them all inside more than anyone wanted and tested the roof in 2 places it hadn't been tested before. But the quality was different. There was something purposeful now in the way Evelyn moved through her days, a clarity of objective that the earlier weeks had lacked. She wrote letters. She wrote to the Kansas Wool Growers Association in Topeka, requesting their most recent price tables. She wrote to 2 cooperative buyers whose names she'd found in the agricultural papers at the post office, asking about their terms and their reach. The postmaster in Granger, a small dry man named Aldous Heck, who had not spoken a welcoming word to her in 3 visits, looked at her letters over his spectacles with an expression that was not quite suspicion but was close to it. "Quite a correspondence," he said. "Business letters," she said, and did not elaborate, and held his gaze until he stamped them. She had started to understand Granger's opinion of her, or what she could triangulate of it from the encounters she'd had in town. The general position seemed to be a watchful skepticism, not hostility, exactly, but the closed reserve of a community that had watched the Calloway place struggle and had made a collective quiet judgment that it was beyond recovering and was now uncertain what to do with a woman who appeared to disagree. At the feed store, a man named Cooperton, who was large and deliberate in everything he did, had asked her how she was settling in with the tone of a man who did not expect a favorable answer. At the dry goods store, two women had been discussing something that stopped when she came through the door and resumed in lower voices when they thought she was occupied with her list. She didn't blame them particularly. She was a stranger. She had showed up on a February train with one trunk and married herself by arrangement to a man these people had known for years, and the only data they had on her was that 3 previous women had left in under 2 months. She would have reserved judgment too. What she would not do was perform for them. She was not going to smile more than she felt, or move through town with the bright eagerness of a person trying to win approval. She did her business, and she was civil, and she let them draw their own conclusions, because in her experience a reputation built on performance didn't hold, and a reputation built on evidence did. The evidence was still accumulating. She knew that. She could be patient. It was Maisie who brought her back the first piece of it, though she didn't know she was doing it. On a Thursday toward the end of February, coming back from the one-room school that stood at the far end of Granger's Main Street, the girl came in and sat at the table and began her homework, and then said, without looking up, "Mrs. Alderholt asked me how you were getting on." "What did you tell her?" "I said you fixed the draft in the hallway and Clover is better and you make biscuits that don't stick to the pan." Evelyn looked up from the pot she was stirring. "How did she take that?" "She said, Maisie paused, chalk poised over her slate. "Mrs. Alderholt says when she's changing her mind about something." Evelyn smiled at the pot, where Maisie couldn't see it. "Good to know," she said. The first letter back from the cooperative buyer came 4 days later, on a Friday, and it was better than she'd hoped. Not a commitment, but an openness to conversation, a set of terms and prices that she copied into her notebook and set next to Rhett's ledger on the parlor desk. She didn't show it to him that night. She showed it to him the next morning at the kitchen table, over coffee, because she'd learned that Rhett Calloway absorbed difficult or important information better in the daylight than at the end of a long day. He read it through twice. He set it down and picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the pasture where the bred ewes were moving slowly across the pale brown grass, heavy with their lambs, 3 weeks at most from the first births. 21 cents guaranteed, he said. 23 if the clip grade's premium. "Yes, our clip grade's premium," he said. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not quite anger, something older than that. The slow-burning kind of feeling that comes when you realize not that something bad happened to you, but that you let it happen, and that the letting was what hurt most. "I believe it does," she said. He set the letter down on top of the ledger. He was quiet for a long moment. "When straw comes," he said, "I'm going to need you there." "I'll be there," she said. He nodded once. He didn't say thank you, which she understood. This was past the point of thank yous. This was 2 people who had crossed into a different kind of working arrangement, one built on something more than practical necessity, though neither of them had named it yet, and she wasn't going to be the one too. She got up and refilled his coffee and went to start on the morning work. And outside, the Kansas sky was white with coming weather, and the ewes moved slowly in the pasture, and somewhere in that flock more than 60 lambs were waiting to be born, and the ranch was not saved yet, was nowhere near saved, but it was different than it had been a month ago, and different, Evelyn had always believed, was where saving started. The letter from the cooperative buyer stayed on the parlor desk, and Evelyn looked at it every time she passed, not because she needed to read it again, but because it was evidence of something real in a situation that still had too many variables she couldn't control. The coming weeks would determine everything, the lambing numbers, the clip quality, and eventually the confrontation with straw that neither she nor Rhett had stopped thinking about, even when they weren't talking about it. But all of that was contingent on something more immediate, getting through the last of winter with the flock intact. March came in hard. The temperature dropped 2 nights running to the kind of cold that cracked the water in the barn troughs by morning and made the horses stand with their tails pressed tight and their heads low. Evelyn had started sleeping lighter since Clover's illness. She'd noticed herself waking at sounds she would have slept through in Missouri, her body having recalibrated to the specific anxieties of a working ranch without her consciously deciding to let it. She'd be up and dressed and out to check the barn before she was fully awake sometimes, her breath coming in clouds, the lamp throwing its small circle against the dark. The bred ewes were restless. She could feel the tension in the flock, that particular collective unease that comes before change, before weather, before birth, before loss. Her grandfather had talked about it, how sheep were social in their anxieties, how one animal's distress moved through a flock like a current through water. She'd thought that was sentiment when she was 8. Now she believed it. It was on the 4th night of March that she found the ewe in trouble. She'd gone out at midnight for no particular reason beyond the wakefulness that had become her norm, and she was moving through the barn with the lamp when she saw the animal in the 3rd pen from the end, a broad-shouldered Rambouillet cross she'd privately named Harriet, for the way she stood at the front of every pen she'd been in, occupying more space than strictly necessary. Harriet was down on her side, and her sides were heaving in a way that was not the slow rhythm of sleep. Evelyn was in the pen before she'd made a conscious decision to go in. The ewe's eyes were showing white at the edges. She'd been in labor long enough that her wool was damp, and when Evelyn ran her hands over the animal's abdomen, she could feel the lamb's position immediately, and it was wrong. Head back, both legs tucked, the lamb pointed the right direction, but not in the configuration that could deliver itself. She'd seen this once before, years ago, and her grandfather had walked her through the correction with the calm specificity of a teacher who knew that panic killed more animals than ignorance. She needed Rhett. She went to the barn door and called his name, not shouting. She'd learned already that his sleep was light the way hers had become, and she heard the house door within 2 minutes and then his boots on the frozen ground. He came in and read the situation without needing it explained and went to the supply shelf for the lanolin and the soft rope and came back and crouched beside her. "I can feel the head," she said. "Left foreleg is forward, right is tucked back." "I've done this," he said. He was already rolling his sleeve. "I know. I just wanted you to know what I found." He worked with a steadiness that she wouldn't have predicted from the first days, when he'd been so closed off that everything about him read like a wall. He was different in the barn. More himself, she thought, or some version of himself he'd stopped being elsewhere. His hands were careful and certain, and he talked quietly to the animal throughout. Low words that weren't quite sentences, the instinctive soothing language of someone who had done this in the dark many times. It took 20 minutes. It was not pleasant. The lamb came out wet and still, and Evelyn's heart dropped one long, terrible beat before the animal shuddered and sneezed and its legs began to move. "There," Rhett said. He sat back on his heels, his arm red to the elbow, breathing harder than he'd let show during the work. "There," Evelyn said. She had the dry rag already, and she worked on the lamb while Rhett helped Harriet to her feet and got her turned toward the smell of her offspring. The ewe was exhausted and confused, and it took her a moment to understand what was at her feet, and then she lowered her head and began to clean her lamb with the focused thoroughness of a creature acting entirely on instruction from somewhere deeper than thought. The lamb was a ram, small but straight-legged, with a pale face and ears that seemed too big for his head. "He'll be all right," Rhett said. He was cleaning his hands with the rag, watching the ewe work on her lamb. His voice had the quality it got sometimes in the barn, quieter than usual, the walls he kept up elsewhere slightly lower. "She worked hard for him," Evelyn said. "They usually do." She looked at Rhett in the lamplight. He hadn't moved from where he was crouched, watching the ewe and lamb, and his profile was the tired, weathered thing she'd seen every morning for a month. But there was something softer in it right now, something that the work and the cold and the long years hadn't quite gotten to. "Thank you for coming out," she said. He looked at her. "You knew what was wrong before I got here. I knew what I could feel. I didn't know if I was right." "You were right." She stayed with Harriet and the lamb until the lamb had nursed for the first time, which took another half-hour of coaxing and positioning and more patience than she'd known she had at 1 in the morning in a cold barn. Rhett stayed too. He didn't offer to go back to bed, and she didn't suggest it, and they sat on opposite sides of the pen, backs against the rails, and watched the small animal figure out the fundamental business of being alive. At some point, the silence became comfortable in the way it sometimes did now between them, not awkward, but shared. The lamp burned steadily. Outside, the wind had quieted to almost nothing, unusual for Kansas. "She'll be one of the first," Rhett said. He meant Harriet. One of the first to lamb this season. The opening of what would be weeks of this, nights broken into pieces, days running on whatever sleep you could find. "How many do you think we'll lose?" Evelyn asked. She asked it plainly, because asking it that way was more respectful than dancing around it. He was quiet for a moment. "Last year I lost 11. Year before, 7. It was a mild spring. What do you need that you don't have?" He thought about it. "Another pair of hands would help. But I can't pay for another pair of hands." "You have mine," she said. He looked at her. It was the same direct look he'd given her at the parlor desk, but there was something in it now that hadn't been there then. Not gratitude exactly, which was too simple, but something more like recognition, the look you give a person when you've stopped calculating them and started seeing them. "You don't have to do the night work," he said. "That wasn't what the arrangement—" "The arrangement," Evelyn said, "was for a woman of steady character and willing disposition. The night work is included." He didn't argue. He nodded once and looked back at the lamb. Chad. The lambing started in earnest 4 days later. What she had understood intellectually, she now understood in her body. In the specific way you can only understand something that wakes you at 3 in the morning and keeps you on your feet for 6 hours, and asks you to make decisions with your hands and your memory and whatever presence of mind you've got left at the end of it. The bred ewes came in waves, not all at once, which was the only mercy. 3 or 4 a day at first, then more, the barn filling with the particular sound of new lambs, that high, insistent calling that was unlike any other sound on the ranch. Evelyn kept records on everything. She had made a chart on a sheet of brown paper tacked to the barn wall. The ewe's number or name, the date, how many lambs, their sex, their starting weight if she could get it, any complications. Rhett watched her do this the first time and didn't comment, but the second day she caught him consulting it while she was elsewhere, running his finger down the columns. Most went without incident, a few didn't. She lost her first lamb on the 3rd day of the main season. A first-timer whose lamb was simply too large and came too late, and neither she nor Rhett could change the outcome despite 2 hours of trying. She went inside after and stood at the kitchen sink and ran cold water over her hands and kept her face very still for several minutes. Maisie, who was home from school with a mild cold, came and stood in the kitchen doorway. "Did you lose one?" the girl asked. "Yes." Maisie came in and sat at the table. She didn't say anything consoling, which Evelyn was grateful for. She just sat there, her presence a kind of company that didn't demand a performance of recovery. After a few minutes, she said, "Papa cried once. After a bad lambing day. He didn't know I saw." Evelyn dried her hands and turned around. "He's allowed to." "I know." Maisie picked at the edge of the table, a habit Evelyn hadn't corrected because there were bigger things to spend correction on. "Are you going to cry?" "Maybe later," Evelyn said honestly. "Right now I need to go back out." Maisie nodded. "I'll have soup ready when you come in." She was 7 years old and she said it like she was 40. Like it was simply what you did when someone needed something practical, and Evelyn felt something in her chest tighten briefly and then release. She went back out. On the 9th day of lambing season, the ewe they called Tessie went down. Tessie was one of the older animals in the flock, a veteran of 4 previous seasons, and Evelyn had noted her in the records from the start as one to watch. Her body condition was good, but she was carrying twins, and she had the look of an animal running on experience rather than reserves. She'd been eating well enough right up to the morning she wasn't, and by the time Evelyn found her in the late afternoon, she was down in the corner of her pen with a fever that registered dangerously high and a heaviness in her breathing that was different from labor. Evelyn stood outside the pen and looked at her and thought carefully about what she was seeing. The twins were still inside her. That was the immediate problem. But the fever meant something else was happening alongside the labor, something that complicated everything, and the choices available narrowed quickly when you laid them out. She went and found Rhett at the water trough. "Tessie," she said. He read her face and came. They stood outside the pen together, and he looked at the ewe and then looked at Evelyn. "How long?" "I think since early afternoon. I should have checked her midday." "We both should have," he said. He was already looking at the signs, running through the same calculation she had. I want to try to help her deliver first, Evelyn said. If the lambs are alive, getting them out gives her the best chance on the fever. But I don't know if she has the strength. I've seen ewes do harder things, he said. I've also seen them not make it through easier ones. I know. They looked at each other, and there was no clean answer in the space between them, just the knowledge that they were going to try and that trying was not a guarantee. What followed was the longest night Evelyn had spent on the Callaway Ranch. The first lamb came after 2 hours of slow, difficult work. Alive, small, a female, which was good news for the flock's future. The second came 40 minutes later, barely conscious, and they worked on it with the dry rag and the warmth of their own hands and their own breath. And after 12 agonizing minutes, it found something inside itself and began to move properly. Tessie was alive, but barely. Her temperature was still too high and her eyes were glazed, and her breathing was the shallow, rapid work of a body running out of reserves. Evelyn mixed the drench she'd used on Clover, adjusted for a heavier animal, and Rhett held the ewe's head while Evelyn administered it, and then there was nothing to do but stay. So they stayed. Maisie appeared in the barn doorway at some point after 9 in the evening, wearing her coat over her nightgown, her hair loose. "Mama," she said, and then stopped, her face going briefly white. She hadn't called Evelyn that before. It came out the way slips always do, from somewhere underneath the decisions you make consciously. Evelyn looked up from where she was kneeling beside the ewe. She kept her voice completely even. "You should be in bed. I couldn't sleep." Maisie came in, not looking at her father, her face controlled the way it was when she was holding something complicated. "How is she?" "Sick," Evelyn said. "But her lambs are here, and they're alive." Maisie came to the pen and looked at the 2 small animals, huddled together under the lamp's warmth, nursing on the ewe, who didn't have much left but was giving what she had. The girl's face did something that Evelyn couldn't have named precisely: grief and love and some kind of ache that was too old for a 7-year-old to be carrying. "Will she live?" Maisie asked. "I don't know," Evelyn said. She'd made a decision early in this place not to soften the uncertain things into false comfort. Children deserved accurate information delivered with steadiness. "She's fighting. We're helping her fight. That's all we can do." Maisie nodded. She looked at Rhett, who was on the other side of the pen, and something passed between father and daughter that Evelyn didn't try to read. Then Maisie sat down on the overturned bucket that had become Evelyn's usual station and tucked her coat around herself and didn't say she was staying, just stayed. Rhett looked at Evelyn over the top of the pen. She gave a small shake of her head, meaning don't send her in, and he understood it, and the 3 of them settled into the long watch. It was past midnight when Tessie's breathing changed. It became slower, which was not what they wanted it to mean, and Evelyn felt her heart sink through the floor. But then the breathing deepened, evened, became less the frantic shallow work of crisis and more the simple rise and fall of a creature resting. She reached through the rail and pressed 2 fingers against the ewe's neck, and the pulse was there, steadier than it had been in hours. "Her fever's breaking," she said. Rhett was beside her before the last word was out, his hand on the animal's side, reading the same signs. He stood there a moment, and then he exhaled slowly through his nose, a long, controlled breath that was the most emotion she'd seen him release since the platform. Maisie had fallen asleep on the bucket, leaning against the post. Her head was at an angle that was going to hurt her neck in the morning. Rhett looked at his daughter, and his face was a difficult thing. Love and grief and something raw and present that he didn't try to hide. Perhaps because he thought Evelyn wasn't watching, or perhaps because he'd stopped caring as much about what she saw. He went in and picked the girl up without waking her, which was a feat of gentleness that Evelyn would not have predicted from the set of those shoulders, and carried her toward the house. "I'll stay with Tessie," Evelyn said quietly. He paused at the barn door with Maisie against his chest, her head on his shoulder. He looked back at Evelyn. The lamplight was between them, and the barn was full of the sound of sheep, and the 2 small lambs were pressed against their mother's side. "She called you?" he started. "I know," Evelyn said. He nodded once. His face was unreadable again, or almost, she thought she could see at the edges the effort it took to close it back down. He went out. She sat beside Tessie through the rest of the night, and the ewe breathed slow and steady, and the lambs slept, and the barn was cold but not unbearable, and Evelyn did not think about what Maisie had said or what Rhett's face had looked like in that moment. She thought about the numbers. She thought about the letter on the parlor desk. She thought about Emmett Straw and his neat ledger entries and the gap between what he'd paid and what the wool was worth, and she let that particular anger, quiet and practical and pointed, keep her awake until dawn. Tessie survived. By the morning of the second day, she was on her feet and eating, weak but present, her twins nursing with the insistent enthusiasm of animals who hadn't yet learned to doubt their own needs. Evelyn noted it in the record, date, outcome, treatment, recovery, and felt the release that comes not from triumph, but from simply not losing. The lambing count was building. By the end of the second week, they had 43 live lambs on the ground from 63 bred ewes, a number that Rhett said was better than the last 2 years combined, though he said it quietly, as if he were afraid to weight it with too much meaning. "It's good numbers," Evelyn said. "It's not over yet," he said. "No, but it's good numbers." He allowed himself briefly to agree. The town had started to notice. She became aware of it gradually, the small calibrations in how Granger looked at her when she came in for supplies or mail. The postmaster, Aldous Heck, had started saying good morning before she reached his window. A woman named Ruth Ferris, who ran the dry goods store, had asked her, without the guarded tone she'd used before, whether she needed help finding the button thread. Small things. The kind of things that don't mean much individually and mean everything in aggregate. Cooperton, the large, deliberate man from the feed store, stopped her on the street on a Thursday with Maisie beside her. "Heard your lambing season's going well," he said. It had the quality of a statement that was also a question. "Reasonably," Evelyn said. He looked at her for a moment, the same measuring look she'd gotten from the platform onward. "Rhett Calloway's a good man," he said finally. "He had some hard years." "He did," she said. Cooperton nodded slowly, his version apparently of an olive branch, and went back into the feed store. Maisie, walking beside Evelyn toward the wagon, said, "That's the most words I've ever heard Mr. Cooperton say to a woman who wasn't his wife." "Is that good?" "Yes," Maisie said. "His wife is the one who decides things." Evelyn filed that away. The lambing finished the third week of March with 58 live lambs from 63 ewes, 5 losses, which Rhett said quietly was the best outcome in 5 years. He said it at dinner, not looking at either of them, in the tone of a man reporting a fact that he doesn't want to let himself feel too much yet. Evelyn served the stew and Maisie cut her bread into 4 pieces, and nobody made a speech about it. But that evening, in the parlor, Rhett put wood on the fire and sat in his chair and said, without preamble, "Straw comes in 5 weeks." "I know," Evelyn said. "The clip will be ready in 3, maybe 3.5. I'll have everything we need by then." She was looking at her notebook. Every weight, every grade, the market comparisons, the cooperative buyer's letter. She paused. "I want to be there when you talk to him." "I know," he said. She looked up at him. He was looking at the fire, not at her, but the side of his face was open in the way the barn made it open, the careful distance lower than usual. "I don't know how he'll react," Rhett said. "He might get ugly." "I've dealt with ugly before," she said. He looked at her then. "I believe you," he said, and meant it simply, without elaboration, which was more than most people managed. The fire burned. Outside in the pasture, 58 new lambs had learned to run in the past week, chasing each other in the ridiculous, gravity-testing way of young animals who haven't yet discovered limits. Maisie had watched them from the fence that afternoon with her hands in her coat pockets and her face entirely unguarded for once, and she'd laughed, a real laugh, the sudden, uncalculated kind, at 2 lambs who ran directly into each other and sat down in mutual confusion. Evelyn had stood beside her at the fence and thought, this is what the ranch looked like before it got so heavy. This is what it can look like again. Not perfect, not certain, but alive, and trying, and worth the trouble. 5 weeks until straw arrived, and she intended to be ready. The 5 weeks passed the way hard-working weeks do. Not slowly, not quickly, but thoroughly. Each day used up entirely before the next one arrived. The spring clip consumed most of it. Shearing was its own particular labor, nothing like the lambing in its demands, but exhausting in a different way. The sustained physical work of moving through a flock of 200 animals with a schedule that didn't accommodate weather or soreness, or the fact that Evelyn had never personally handled shearing equipment before arriving at this ranch. She said as much to Rhett on the first morning before the hired shearer arrived, a compact, weathered man named Dooley, who came through the county every spring and worked with the efficient speed of someone who had made the same motions 10,000 times. "I can help with handling," she told Rhett, "moving them in and out, skirting the fleece. Tell me what you need." "Have you skirted before?" "Once. My grandfather showed me the basics." He nodded. "Stay close to Dooley the first hour and watch how he grades. He's fast and he won't explain twice, so pay attention the first time." She paid attention. Skirting was the work done immediately after the fleece came off, pulling away the dirty edges, the stained sections, the second cuts that would drag the grade down, leaving the clean blanket of wool that represented the real value of the animal's year. It was detailed, unglamorous work, and she did it on her knees on the barn floor while Dooley moved through the flock at his relentless pace, and Rhett kept the animals moving, and the day wore on, and her back told her things she didn't need to hear. But she was also grading. Quietly, alongside everything else, she was running Dooley's assessments through her own knowledge, the staple length, the fineness, the brightness of the clip, and writing it all in her notebook, animal by animal. By the end of the first day, she had 26 animals recorded. By the end of shearing, she had the whole flock. The numbers were good, better than good. The Callaway clip was consistently premium grade. The staple length was strong, the fineness was in the upper range for Rambouillet cross, and the skirted weights were solid. She added it up twice in her notebook and then a third time because she wanted to be sure. And then she put the notebook on the parlor desk next to the cooperative buyer's letter and sat looking at both for a long moment. Rhett came in while she was sitting there. He saw her face and came to the desk without being asked. He looked at her numbers. He looked at the buyer's letter. He did the math the same way she had, which she could see from the movement of his eyes across the page. "That's more than twice what Straw has been paying us," he said. "Yes." He put the notebook down. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at the parlor wall, at the photograph of Clara in her good dress, and his jaw worked once. "I keep thinking about how many years this has been going on," he said, "and I can't." He stopped. "I keep wanting to put a number on what it cost us, what we didn't have that we should have had." "I know," Evelyn said. "Maisie's coat," he said. The words came out flat and hard. "Last winter, I told her we'd get a better one next season because I couldn't—" He stopped again. Evelyn didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't be either insufficient or presumptuous, and she'd learned enough about this man to know that what he needed in this moment was not comfort, which would feel like minimizing, but the simple steadiness of someone not looking away. After a while, he said, "When does he come?" "3 days," she said. "I got word from Aldous at the post office. Straw sent a letter to his usual clients last week. He'll be making his rounds starting Thursday." Rhett looked at her. "Is everything ready?" "Everything is ready." She had prepared the way she prepared for anything she couldn't afford to get wrong, methodically, without assuming she'd covered everything, going back over it the morning before and the morning of. The records were organized in chronological order, going back 4 years. The gap between received price and market price laid out in figures that were clear enough to follow without explanation. The cooperative buyer's letter was there, with the price terms underlined in pencil. She had written out, on a separate sheet, the wool industry pricing she'd pulled from the Kansas Wool Growers Correspondence, with the source noted. She had a letter from her grandfather's old records, which she'd kept in the bottom of her trunk for no reason she'd ever been able to articulate, showing what premium merino clip had sold for in Ohio 8 years ago. Not a direct comparison, but useful context for someone trying to argue that current prices were simply what the market bore. She laid it all on the kitchen table the evening before and went through it piece by piece in her head, the way you'd rehearse an argument, identifying the weak points and deciding how to address them. Then she cleared it all away and made dinner and did not mention it to Rhett, because he knew what was coming, and repeating it would just feed anxiety neither of them needed more of. Maisie asked at dinner, "Is Mr. Straw coming tomorrow?" "Thursday," Rhett said. Maisie pushed her stew around. "Tommy Holt at school said his father sells to Mr. Straw too. He said Mr. Straw is a fair man." Neither Rhett nor Evelyn responded immediately. Maisie looked at Evelyn and then at her father. He's not, Rhett said. He said it without anger, just as a fact he'd accepted. We're going to talk to him about it. Maisie was quiet for a moment. Will he be angry? Probably, Evelyn said. But that's his problem, not ours. Maisie turned this over, her brow slightly furrowed, and then she nodded with the decisive quality she had when she'd worked something through. Okay, she said, and went back to her stew. Emmett Straw arrived on a Thursday morning just after 10, which was earlier than Evelyn had expected. She heard the wagon before she saw it, a heavy, well-kept rig with a canvas cover over the bed, pulled by a matched pair of grays that were the nicest horses she'd seen in this county. The man himself was somewhere past 50, broad through the chest, with a gray-streaked beard trimmed close and the kind of face that arranged itself easily into an expression of goodwill. He climbed down from the wagon with the ease of a man comfortable in his own skin, and when he shook Rhett's hand in the yard, he did it warmly, with both hands, the way men did when they were establishing a tone. Evelyn stood on the porch. He looked at her once, assessed her in the way she'd become accustomed to being assessed in Granger, and then looked back at Rhett. This your wife? Yes, Rhett said. Evelyn. Straw looked at her again, slightly longer this time. She met it directly. Ma'am, he said, with the kind of courtesy that was technically respectful and contained within it the assumption that she would now go inside. She did not go inside. I'll be joining the conversation, she said. I've been managing the ranch records. Something moved through Straw's expression. Not offense exactly, but a kind of recalibration, the adjustment of a man whose comfortable routine had been slightly disturbed. He looked at Rhett. Rhett said nothing. Of course, Straw said, still pleasant. Always good to have organized records. They went to the barn. This was standard. The buyer inspected the clip before discussing price, which was reasonable. And Evelyn had expected it and wanted it because the clip was the foundation of everything she was going to say. The wool was bagged and stacked, labeled in her hand, the total weight noted. Straw walked the bags with the practiced eye of someone who had been grading wool since before Evelyn was born, pulling small samples, checking staple length between his fingers, holding sections up to the barn light. He was good at it. She gave him that. He knew wool. Fine clip this year, he said. He set down the last sample and turned to Rhett. Strong staple, clean. Your management's improved. He glanced at Evelyn, which was as close as he came to crediting her. Thank you, Rhett said. He was standing with his arms at his sides, his voice even, and Evelyn could see the effort it took him to keep it that way. I can do 14 cents a pound on the blanket clips, Straw said. He said it the way he'd clearly said it many times, with the comfortable authority of a man stating a known number. 13 on the skirtings, based on current market. Evelyn opened her notebook. The current market rate for premium Rambouillet cross clip is between 21 and 23 cents per pound, she said. She kept her voice level, the way she'd practiced it in her head. Not aggressive, just stating facts the way you'd state the weather. We have a letter from a cooperative buyer in Abilene offering 21 cents guaranteed with potential for 23 on premium grade. Your clip assessment just described this as premium grade. Straw looked at her. The goodwill expression was still there, but it had thinned slightly around the edges. Mrs. Calloway, the market's more complicated than... I have the Kansas wool growers price table from February of this year, she said, and put the sheet on the wool bag in front of him. And records of the price you've paid this ranch for the past 4 years against the market rate for those same years. She put those down too. Straw looked at the papers. He didn't pick them up. He looked at Rhett. Rhett, this is... Look at the numbers, Rhett said. His voice was quiet and hard. Straw looked at the numbers. He took longer than he needed to, which she read as a man trying to find an angle rather than a man trying to understand figures he hadn't seen before. He had known what he was doing. He had known it every year when he wrote those numbers in his own ledger. These price tables don't account for transport, handling, my overhead. I've accounted for transport and handling, Evelyn said. The column on the right is net of standard trade costs. The gap is still 9 cents per pound. On this year's clip alone, at the weight we're selling, that's the difference between, she turned to the next page, $412 and $867. The number sat in the barn air between the three of them. Straw's expression had moved past thinning goodwill and into something less comfortable for him. A man who has been caught, deciding in real time how to respond to being caught. Evelyn had thought about this moment, had tried to prepare for several versions of it. She had thought he might get loud, or that he might go cold, or that he might try to discredit her somehow. What he did was look at Rhett. "Rhett," he said, and his voice had dropped to the man-to-man register, the one that assumed Evelyn was a complication rather than a party to the conversation. "Your father-in-law and I did business for 15 years. You and I have done business for 6. That's 21 years of—" "21 years of what?" Rhett said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 21 years of paying below market on every clip we sold you? Now, that's not— "Is it wrong?" Rhett said. He put his finger on the page with the 4-year comparison. "Are these numbers wrong?" Straw looked at the numbers again. His jaw moved once. "The market is variable. Not by 9 cents every year in the same direction," Evelyn said. "A variable market moves both ways." The barn was quiet except for the sheep in their pens and the sound of the spring wind at the eaves. Straw looked at Evelyn with an expression she recognized. Not quite hostility, but the particular displeasure of a man who has built a practice on people's inattention and encountered someone who was paying attention. He had not built that practice on malice exactly, she thought. He had built it on the gradual assumption that no one would ever check, and then on the further assumption that when someone finally did, they could be managed. He looked at Red again. 20 cents, he said, on the blanket clips. 21, Evelyn said. 23 on premium grade. I can't do 23 on the whole clip. There's gradation in every... I know there's gradation, she said. I graded it myself, animal by animal. I have the breakdown by grade category. 64% of this clip meets premium specification. 21 cents on the base grade, 23 on the premium. She turned to the relevant page and put it in front of him. That's what the cooperative buyer offered. That's what you're competing with. Another silence. Straw looked at the papers. He looked at Rhett. He looked at Evelyn, and this time the assessment in his gaze was of a different quality. Not dismissive, but wary. The look of someone who had realized he had underestimated what he was dealing with. You're going to take everything to the cooperative, he said. It was somewhere between a statement and a question. That depends on what you offer, Evelyn said. We have a working relationship with this county going back 21 years, as you said. We'd prefer to maintain a working relationship if the terms are fair, but not otherwise. Rhett was watching Straw with an expression that Evelyn would only understand fully later. The expression of a man who had spent years feeling vaguely diminished by a situation he couldn't quite name, and who was feeling, for the first time, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of standing on level ground. Straw was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the papers once more, not as if he were still looking for an argument, but as if he were accepting something he'd been trying not to accept. 21 on base, he said. 22 on premium. That's my offer. 21 and 23, Evelyn said. Those are the cooperative's terms. We're not taking less for the sake of convenience. She saw Rhett look at her briefly from the side. She didn't look back. Straw exhaled. It was a slow, controlled breath, the breath of a man recalculating something. 21 and 23, he said, on this clip. And going forward, Evelyn said, this isn't a one-year adjustment. This is the price. The word forward hung in the air. Straw understood what it meant, that this was not a concession he was making to a difficult year, but an acknowledgement that the old arrangement was over. Going forward, he said finally, if the clip stays premium, keep your management at this level, she said, which was as close as she was going to come to acknowledging that the management being kept was hers, and the clip will stay premium. Straw looked at Rhett. Your wife drives a hard bargain. She knows what things are worth, Rhett said. He said it without expression, as a plain fact, and it was the most direct thing Evelyn had heard him say about her since she arrived. Straw left 2 hours later with a bill of sale that Evelyn had written out herself in her careful hand, with every number specified and signed by both parties. She watched the matched grays pull his wagon back toward the road, and then she went into the barn and stood in the middle of the aisle, alone for the first time in several hours, and let herself exhale fully. Her hands were not quite steady. She noticed this and allowed it. the body's delayed response to what the mind had been holding down for the duration. She'd been calm in there because she needed to be, not because it hadn't cost her anything. She heard Rhett come in behind her. She turned around and his face was doing several things at once, which was unusual for a face that generally worked hard to do only one thing at a time. She could see relief and anger and something older, something that had been held under pressure for a long time and had found now a small opening. $453 difference, he said. This year alone. Yes. On a single clip. He looked at the bagged wool stacked along the barn wall. 4 years, Evelyn. I know. He put his hand on the top rail of the nearest pen and stood there, and she watched him work through something that she understood was not going to come out as a speech or a declaration, but as whatever small, true thing he was capable of when the pressure got high enough. I should have looked harder, he said. I knew something was wrong with how thin things were. I told myself it was the market, told myself it was the weather, told myself it was Clara dying and me not keeping the place upright. He paused. It wasn't any of those things. It was those things too, Evelyn said. Just not only those things. He looked at her. You did all of this in, he seemed to be counting. 11 weeks. I had good information to work with. You kept the flock well. The animals are the foundation. I just read the numbers differently. He was quiet. She could see him not quite believing the minimizing, which was fair because it was only partly true. She had worked hard and she knew it, and saying otherwise was its own kind of dishonesty. But she also meant it. She had not built this from nothing. She had found something worth building on. Thank you, he said. He said it the same way he'd said it after Clover recovered, rusty and direct, a man for whom those words cost something real. You'd have found it yourself eventually, she said. Maybe. He didn't look like he believed that either, but not in time. She didn't argue with that because it was probably true. The news moved through Granger the way news did in small towns. Not announced, but absorbed, present everywhere within 2 days. She didn't know exactly how it traveled. Perhaps Straw had talked. Perhaps someone had seen his wagon at the Calloway place and drawn conclusions. Perhaps it was simply the way these things worked, the community's antenna for change always out and sensitive. What she noticed was the change in the quality of the town's attention. Cooperton stopped her outside the feed store on Saturday with more than the 3 measured sentences he'd offered before. He asked about the clip weight, about the breed composition of the flock, about whether she thought the cooperative buyer model was something other ranchers ought to be looking at. He asked the way a man asks when he's been thinking about something and has found a person he thinks might have useful thoughts on it. Ruth Ferris at the dry goods store asked if Evelyn had time for coffee sometime. Just like that. Sometime. As if it were a given that there would be a sometime and that it would be worth having. Mrs. Alderholt, the woman Maisie had reported as saying when she was changing her mind, stopped Evelyn near the post office and said without preamble, My husband's been selling to Straw for 12 years. I don't suppose you'd be willing to look over our records. Evelyn looked at her. She was a tall woman, direct-eyed, the kind of person who asked for things plainly. Bring them by the ranch, Evelyn said. Any afternoon that suits you. Mrs. Alderholt nodded once, as if that were settled, and went on her way. Maisie, who had been standing beside Evelyn and had heard the whole exchange, said nothing until they were back at the wagon. Then she said, She never stops to talk to people. She did today, Evelyn said. Maisie climbed up on the wagon seat. People are paying attention to you different now. I noticed. Is that good? Evelyn gathered the reins and looked out at the main street of Granger, at the modest storefronts and the unpainted fences and the flat sky above it all, and thought about the question seriously because it deserved a serious answer. It's useful, she said. Good is when they trust you enough to ask for help. That takes longer. Maisie considered this and then said, Mrs. Alderholt just asked for help. Yes, Evelyn said. She did. She set the horse moving toward home, and the afternoon was mild for the first time since she'd arrived in this county. Genuinely mild, the kind that suggested spring had finally made up its mind. And the road back to the ranch ran straight through the flat country with its wide sky and its wide distances. And somewhere out in the pastures beyond the road, the spring lambs were running in the afternoon light, and the wool from this year's clip was going to sell for what it was actually worth for the first time in 4 years. It was not fixed. She did not think of it as fixed. There was the debt still to address, and the porch that still sagged on the left side, and the work of every day that didn't stop because one thing had gone right. But the arithmetic of the place had changed, and changed arithmetic changed what was possible, and what was possible here had just become a great deal larger than it had been when she stepped off a train in February with $14 in a single trunk, and nobody in Granger expecting much of her arrival. She thought that was enough for now. She thought that was, in fact, quite a lot. The money from Straw arrived 10 days after he left, which was faster than Evelyn had expected, and which she took as a sign that he understood the new terms were not negotiable. The bank draft was for $841, the largest single payment the Callaway Ranch had received in 4 years, possibly longer. Rhett held it for a moment at the kitchen table before handing it to her, and she took it and looked at it and put it on the table between them, and they both sat with it for a while without saying anything, the way you sit with something that has weight. "The feed debt first," Rhett said. "Yes. And the supply account at Ferris's store." She had the list already. She'd been maintaining it in her notebook alongside the records, a column of obligations ranked by urgency and interest. After those, the porch repair before winter. The rest goes to reserves. He nodded. He was looking at the draft, not at her. There won't be much left after the debts. $70, maybe $80, but the debts will be clear. She paused. That's not nothing. That's a place to stand. He picked up the draft. He looked at it one more time, and then he folded it into his shirt pocket and stood up. "I'll go to town tomorrow." "I'll come with you," she said. "I told Mrs. Alderholt I'd look at her records this week." He looked at her. Something in his face had the quality it occasionally got now, a kind of unguarded directness that arrived without announcement and retreated the same way. "You're going to be doing this for half the county before the summer's out." "Maybe," she said, "if people ask." "They'll ask." He said it simply. "You know what you're doing, and word moves fast in a small county." She thought about that after he left the kitchen, about what it meant to be known for something in a place where you'd arrived as nobody, as a name on a letter, as a question mark that the community had already half answered in the negative before she'd stepped off the train. She had not come here to fix anyone else's accounts. She had come because she was out of options, and a practical arrangement had presented itself, and she had the sense to take it. But things grew in directions you didn't plan for, if the conditions were right. June arrived the way Kansas June does, not gradually, but all at once, the temperature climbing a full 20 degrees in a single week, the grass going from pale to green almost overnight, the sky changing its quality from the hard white of winter to something deeper and more blue. The lambs were 4 months old now, and indistinguishable from yearlings to anyone who hadn't watched them be born, and the pastures held a kind of movement and noise that the ranch had not had when Evelyn arrived. She stood at the fence on a Thursday morning, coffee in hand, watching the flock graze, and did the quiet accounting she had taken to doing out here rather than at the table, not the financial kind which lived in her notebook and was accurate to the last cent, but the other kind. The kind where you take stock of where things are and how far they've come from where they were. The porch was fixed. Rhett had done it in April with lumber from the Cooperton yard, and it no longer sagged on the left, and she had found the experience of watching him work on it, patient, precise, nothing wasted, quietly illuminating in the way that watching a person do something they're genuinely good at always was. He'd done it over 2 days while she painted the front of the house, which had not been discussed in advance. She had simply started painting one morning, and he had looked at her from the porch frame and not said anything. And by the second day, Maisie was painting the low sections with a smaller brush, while Evelyn did the high parts from a ladder that Rhett steadied without being asked. The house looked different, not new. It was not a new house, and nothing was going to make it one, but attended to, like a place where people had decided to care about the details again. Inside, the accounts were different too. The feed debt was cleared. The supply account at Ferris's was cleared. There was a leather-bound notebook on the parlor desk that was different from Rhett's old cracked green ledger. New, purchased in town, the entries in Evelyn's hand on one side and Rhett's on the other, a collaboration that had developed without either of them proposing it. She kept the market research and the wool records and the household expenses. He kept the livestock records and the land costs and the equipment repairs. Together, the picture was complete in a way that neither half was alone. She had helped 4 other ranching families in the county by June. Mrs. Alderholt's husband had been underpaid by straw for 11 years, a figure that came out of the records with a clarity that left them both sitting at their kitchen table in a silence that had nothing to do with uncertainty. The Ferris family, Ruth's in-laws, who ran cattle east of Granger, had a different problem, a supplier agreement with bad terms that they'd signed in a difficult year and renewed out of habit. 2 others had variations of the same basic story. People who knew their operations but hadn't been watching the numbers from the outside, and who had in one way or another been relying on the good faith of men whose good faith was conditional. She did not charge for any of it. That was not why she was doing it. She was doing it because the knowledge was there and the need was there, and refusing to share what you knew when it cost you nothing. To share, it seemed like a particular kind of waste she wasn't willing to practice. But she was also honest with herself about the other thing it did. It built a position in this community that no amount of friendliness would have built, because it was not based on being liked, but on being useful, which was a more reliable foundation. Red had said once, in March, that she knew what she was doing, and that word moved fast. He'd been right about both. Nah, it was Maisie who said the thing that needed saying, the way Maisie had a habit of doing, arriving at the truth by the most direct available route, without the detours adults took. It was an evening in late June, warm enough to have the windows open, the smell of grass coming through on a soft wind. They were in the parlor, Rhett with his harness repair, Evelyn with her notebook, Maisie on the rug with a drawing she'd been working on for 3 days, a detailed rendering of the pasture with every lamb individually included, which had required a level of observational commitment that Evelyn found genuinely impressive. "Are you going to stay?" Maisie asked. She asked it the way she asked most things. Not combatively, not anxiously, just as a real question that she wanted a real answer to. Rhett's hand stilled on the harness. Evelyn looked up from the notebook. "I live here," she said. "I know," Maisie said. She was still looking at her drawing. "But some people live somewhere and they're still deciding. I want to know if you're still deciding." The fire was low. Just coals, the June evening not requiring more. And the lamplight was warm, and the room was the kind of quiet that a room gets when the people in it have gotten used to each other's sounds and silences. Evelyn looked at the girl on the rug, and then at Rhett, who was looking at neither of them, his hands resting on the unfinished harness, his expression doing that thing it did when he was waiting for something he was afraid to wait with hope. "I'm not still deciding," Evelyn said. Maisie looked up. "Okay," she said. She looked at her father. "Papa, she's not still deciding." Rhett looked at his daughter and then at Evelyn, and something in his face moved through several things at once and came out the other side as something simpler and quieter than any of them. A relief so thorough it had no performance in it. The face of a man who had been holding his breath for months and had finally, quietly, stopped. "I heard her," he said. His voice was rough. Maisie returned to her drawing. "Good," she said. "I didn't want to have to find another one." Evelyn laughed. It came out before she could decide whether it was appropriate, which was how the best laughs always came, and after a moment Rhett made a sound that was also a laugh, low and brief, and Maisie looked up at both of them with the satisfied expression of someone who had said the right thing and knew it. There were still hard things. There would always be hard things, because the frontier did not rearrange itself around a good spring and a fair price and a fixed porch. The summer brought a stretch of drought in July that dried the grass to straw and required moving the flock between pastures twice a week to keep them on anything green. And Evelyn and Rhett were in the saddle more days than not, which was work she had not done much of before arriving at this ranch, and which her body logged as a complaint every morning until she got moving. There was a fence failure in the east pasture that let 15 animals into a neighboring property and required an afternoon of retrieval and a conversation with the neighboring rancher that was awkward enough that she let Rhett handle it and spent the time mending what had broken. There was a week in August when Maisie had a fever that wasn't serious, but was serious enough to keep Evelyn close to the house and distracted, watching the girl sleep with the specific anxiety of someone who understood that fevers in this country could be or not be many things. None of it broke them. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not that nothing went wrong, but that the wrong things didn't break them, because they had the resources now to absorb them. The financial margin was small, but real. The working relationship between her and Rhett had become fluent in the way that good working relationships became. Each of them knowing without extensive discussion what the other was doing and what they needed, the overlap between their competencies covering most situations and the gaps covered by asking without embarrassment. The asking without embarrassment was new on both sides. She had gotten better at it than she expected she would. She had come here carrying the specific independence of a woman who had needed to be self-sufficient for most of her adult life. And that independence was not wrong, but it had a rigidity to it that she'd had to loosen. And the loosening had not come naturally. There had been a moment in April when she'd been trying to fix the water trough valve by herself for 2 hours, and Rhett had come around the corner of the barn and looked at the situation and looked at her and said, "Do you want help with that?" And she had said, more sharply than she meant, "I've almost got it." And he had said, "Okay," and gone away and come back 20 minutes later with a different tool that turned out to be the right one. And she had taken it without comment and fixed the valve, and afterwards she'd said, "Thank you for the wrench." And he'd said, "I've been fighting that valve for 2 years, which was as close as either of them came to acknowledging what had actually happened. She was learning, still. She thought she would probably always be learning. That was not a comfortable thing to admit if you'd spent your life thinking of competence as a destination you arrived at rather than a road you stayed on. But it was true, and she had started to prefer true things to comfortable ones some years ago. In August, Rhett came to find her at the kitchen garden, which she had restored from the stalks and frozen mud she'd found in February, to something that was producing more than they needed, which meant she was regularly bringing vegetables to town or leaving them on the Alderholt porch. He came and stood at the garden fence and watched her work for a moment before he said anything, which was normal. He was not a man who arrived anywhere speaking. "I got a letter," he said. She looked up. His face was carefully neutral, which meant it was something he'd been thinking about. "From Clara's parents, her father." He had the letter in his hand, folded. "He's been hearing things about the ranch." She waited. "He asked if the ranch was doing better." He looked at the letter. "He and Clara's mother are in Topeka. They're old." He said. He stopped for a moment. He said he'd been wondering if he should have helped more after Clara died. He said he didn't know how to. Evelyn pulled off her gloves. She came to the fence and leaned on it. "Are you going to write back?" "I think I have to." He looked at her. "He's Maisie's grandfather." "He is," she said. He folded the letter again, a slow, deliberate movement. "I don't—" He started and stopped. I was angry at him for a while. After. He had money and we were struggling and he didn't offer and I didn't ask and it just— He exhaled. It sat there. And now? He thought about it the way he thought about things that deserved thinking. Now I think two people can both be wrong about how to handle a hard situation, and both of them can be right that the other one should have done something different. And that's just— He shook his head slightly. That's just what happens between people. She thought about that for a moment. About the distance between two people who are both waiting for the other one to move and neither of them moving, and how that distance grows in the waiting until it feels like something that was done deliberately when it wasn't. It was just two people who didn't know how and didn't ask for help knowing. "Write to him," she said. "Tell him the ranch is doing well. Tell him Maisie's doing well." She paused. "If he asks to visit, let him." Rhett looked at her. "You wouldn't mind that." "He's Maisie's grandfather," she said again. "She should know him." He was quiet for a moment and she could see him working through something. The old grievance against the new reality. The way you had to choose, sometimes, between the satisfaction of holding on to a wound and the more demanding work of letting it become something else. He didn't always make that choice easily. She didn't either. But he was a man who had been reshaped by loss into someone who understood, maybe better than most, that the things you refused to let go of had a way of costing you more than the things that hurt you in the first place. "All right," he said. She went back to the garden. He stayed at the fence a moment longer, looking at the letter, and then he put it in his pocket and went back to the barn. On a Saturday afternoon in late August, Evelyn walked to the far pasture and stood at the fence and looked at the Callaway flock, and she did the accounting again. The quiet kind, the kind that wasn't in any notebook, 212 animals, counting the spring lambs. The flock was larger than it had been in February by 58. The wool quality was documented, graded, on record. The fall clip would go at the new price. She had already exchanged 2 letters with the cooperative buyer in Abilene confirming terms for the autumn, and she had written to Straw with the same terms as spring, firmly, without apology. The debts were cleared, the house was painted, the porch was straight, the parlor fireplace was used every evening that warranted it, and on several that didn't strictly require it, but that warranted it in some other way. The kitchen was the warm center of the house, in the particular way a kitchen became when 3 people used it consistently, and each of them contributed something to it. Maisie, her biscuits, made now without supervision. Rhett, his occasional and surprisingly competent work with venison. Evelyn, everything else. And the general order of a kitchen that had been brought back from entropy by someone who believed that the organization of a household was not a trivial matter, but an act of sustained attention that made everything else easier. She heard the fence gate open and Maisie appeared beside her, slightly out of breath in the way of children who don't actually need to run, but choose to. "What are you doing?" Maisie asked. "Looking at the flock." Maisie leaned on the fence rail and looked too, with the same contemplative seriousness she brought to most things. The sheep grazed in the long August light, unhurried, the lambs scattered among the adults now, the whole flock moving with the slow coherence of a thing that was healthy and unhurried. "Clover's out there," Maisie said. Evelyn looked. She found the yearling toward the middle of the flock, full-grown now, unrecognizable in a photograph from the sick animal in the barn pen in February, her wool thick and her bearing easy. Clover had grown into one of the calmer animals in the flock, the kind that other sheep drifted toward when something disturbed them, which was not a quality Evelyn had expected and which she found quietly satisfying. "She is," Evelyn said. "You saved her," Maisie said. She said it the way she said most things, plainly, as a statement of fact. "I sat with her for a night," Evelyn said. "She saved herself." Maisie considered this with her characteristic seriousness. "Papa says the same thing about people, that you can help someone, but you can't do it for them." "Your father is right about that." The girl was quiet for a moment, her arms folded on the top rail the way Evelyn's were, the 2 of them standing in the same posture without having arranged it. The sun was low enough now that the light came in at the angle that made the grass look golden rather than merely green, and the shadows of the fence posts stretched long across the ground. "Do you think we'll have a good year next year?" Maisie asked. It was the kind of question that deserved a real answer, not a reassuring one. Evelyn thought about it honestly, about the state of the flock, the state of the finances, the state of the market, the 100 variables that a ranch year contained and that no one could fully anticipate. "I think we'll have a better chance at a good year than we had this time last year," she said. "That's different from knowing for certain. Nothing out here is certain for certain." "But better chance," Maisie said. "Better chance." Maisie nodded, apparently satisfied with this calibration. Then she said, "I'm going to draw the flock tonight, all of them." She looked at the 212 animals spread across the pasture. "It might take more than one night. It might take a week," Evelyn said. "That's okay?" The girl straightened up from the fence. "I have time." She said it simply, the way a child says it, without understanding the full weight of what she was saying. That having time meant having a future, meant living in a place stable enough that you could make a plan that extended past tomorrow, meant not wondering in some low, constant background way whether the thing you were living in was going to hold. Evelyn heard the weight of it, even if Maisie didn't, and she let it sit for a moment. This plain, unremarkable thing that was not plain or unremarkable at all. That evening, Rhett was in the parlor before either of them, which was unusual. He was generally the last in, coming from the final barn check after Maisie was already settled, and Evelyn was finishing the kitchen. But he was in his chair when they came in, and there was wood on the fire, which was unnecessary in August, but which he'd done anyway. And when Evelyn came in and saw the low fire and the lamp and his figure in the chair, she thought, for a moment, of the first time she'd lit that fire back in February, when he hadn't come in, and the difference between then and now was a measure she didn't have a unit for. She sat in her chair. Maisie settled on the rug with her drawing board. For a while no one spoke, and the quiet was the kind that needed no filling. Then Rhett said, not looking up from the harness he was working on, the fall clip should be ready mid-October. I'll write to the cooperative buyer next week, Evelyn said. Confirm the date. I was thinking, he said, and paused with the pause of someone choosing their words carefully. If the fall numbers hold, we could put money toward expanding the breeding stock, buy 2 or 3 more quality ewes in the spring, grow the flock over 2 years instead of waiting. Evelyn looked at him. He was still looking at the harness, but his posture had the quality it got when he was saying something that mattered more than the words suggested. That's a good idea, she said. You'd have to approve the animals, he said. Your judgment on the breed quality is better than mine. We'd pick together, she said. He looked at her then. Just for a moment, the way he did things, briefly, directly, without the armor that was so much his habitual expression that she'd stopped noticing it except in the moments it wasn't there. This was one of those moments. He looked at her, and the firelight was between them, and Maisie was drawing on the rug with the focused silence of a child entirely absorbed in her work, and what passed in that look was nothing that was going to be named or narrated. It was just the look of 2 people who had come to an understanding that was more than the words they'd said to each other, and both of them knew it, and neither of them required more than that. Together, he said. She thought about what Maisie had drawn, later, when she was alone in her room with the window open to the August night. The girl had shown her a section of it before bed, a partial landscape with the fence line and the flock beginning to populate the middle ground, each animal distinct, the proportions slightly off in the way children's drawings were off. But the intention precise, the observation genuine. She'd drawn Clover in the center, slightly larger than was strictly accurate, the way you drew the things that mattered to you. Evelyn had looked at it and thought, this is what memory looks like before it knows its memory. This is a child making a record of a time she will look back on. The ranch in a particular summer, the flock healthy, the light long in the evenings, the fence straight, the house behind it with fresh paint, and a porch that didn't sag. She had come here a stranger. She had come with a single trunk and uncertain prospects, and a letter she'd read so many times, the folds had begun to split. She had come because she'd run out of other options, which was not a romantic origin story, but it was an honest one, and she had decided long ago that honesty was worth more than romance when you were trying to build something that would last. What she had not anticipated, what she would not have known how to anticipate from the platform in Granger in February, looking at a quiet man who wouldn't quite meet her eyes and a child who gave nothing away, was that what she would find here was not a place that needed saving so much as a place that needed someone to believe it was worth saving. The flock was there. The land was there. The man was there, steady and capable, and hollowed by grief in the way people were hollowed when they'd loved something real and lost it. The girl was there, keeping herself together with a discipline that was heartbreaking and admirable in equal measure. All of it was there, waiting, needing not a rescue but a witness, someone to look at what was actually present instead of what had been lost and say, this is enough to work with. This is the beginning of something. She had been that person, it turned out. She had not known she was that person when she answered the letter. You rarely knew what you were capable of until you were in the middle of needing to be capable of it. The night was warm and the crickets were loud in the grass, and somewhere in the pasture the flock was quiet, and the lambs that had been born in a cold barn in March were sleeping in the August dark, grown past recognition from the small, wet, uncertain things they'd been at the beginning. Everything changed. Everything that was going to last had to survive the changing. That was not a comforting thought exactly, but it was a true one, and she had come to prefer true things. She thought about what she would tell someone who found themselves where she had been in February, stepping off a train into a cold she hadn't prepared for, looking for a man she'd never met, holding a letter that was the last option on a short list. She would tell them, look at what's actually there, not at what you were told to expect, not at what you're afraid of, not at what's broken and missing and worn down. Look at what's actually there and be honest about whether it's worth staying for. She had looked. She had stayed. And the staying, it turned out, was the only thing. Not the cleverness of the records or the confrontation with straw or the long nights in the barn, though all of those had mattered. The foundation was simply the decision to stay long enough to find out what was possible, made again each morning, made on the hard days with full knowledge of what it cost, made without the guarantee of return. That was all it ever was. really. In a ranch and in a life, and in the quiet, complicated work of making yourself at home in a place that did not begin as your home. You decided to stay. You showed up the next morning, you found out what was there. She closed the window against the night air and went to bed, and the ranch was quiet around her. The particular quiet of a working place at rest, full of the small sounds of animals breathing and wood settling and wind in the evegrass. And it was hers, or she was its, or more accurately, the two of them had arrived at the kind of claim that goes in both directions, the only kind worth having. Outside in the pasture, Clover grazed in the dark. The lambs slept. The fence held.